Hi, this is JC one more time. Yeah, my little granddaughter told me the other day, gosh, Uncle James, I like to hear you tell those stories about things that happened to you when you were a little child. They're so interesting and you tell them so well. Well, I enjoy telling them too. And when I go back and read them sometimes now, it's like I'm reading what is just a story and it's about someone else, not about me, but they are about me and I love to tell them. I was going back over my blog again, a time and a place, and I came across this story here that might be interesting to some of you. This is a story about disabilities, certain disabilities, and the difference in how people thought about disabilities back when this actually took place around 1946, when I was 10 years old, and what it would have been like now. I'll go ahead and start the story. I'll read most of it, but yeah, I made it kind of short in my Jim's journal and in the blog here, so I'll embellish it just a little bit with a few things that I remember to make it a little bit longer, a little more of a story. So without further ado, I called it here Remembering Again when I was 10, but I'm going to call it The Young Man. And I start off, I was thinking about people with disabilities, and I remembered a young man from when I was a child in Modesto around 1946 or so. I lived in Modesto on the east side by the airport, in the airport district also known as Little Okie. And I have an asterisk here, by the way, there's another Little Okie in Modesto. It's better known as South Modesto Acres, but the airport district is and always has been Little Okie to many of us. Anyhow, there's a small town east of Modesto called Empire. In 1946, Empire was about 5 miles from Modesto. Now, due to tremendous growth, it's closer to 2 miles than 5, and maybe not even quite 2 miles. Now, the main street that ran from Modesto to Empire is called Yosemite Boulevard. In those days, most of Yosemite Boulevard on the one side of the street, actually on the north side of the street, there were all houses over there, and on the south side of the street, a railroad track ran across there. So all the houses were over on the north side of Yosemite Boulevard. Now, there were a lot of big houses on Yosemite Boulevard. Um, the road that goes from Modesto to Empire, they seemed then to me to be very big, considering I was raised in a little one-room shack about 12 by 14 back over in Little Okie. When I was a kid, I passed by those houses a couple of times a week for one reason or another. There was one in particular that stood out to me. I was very impressed with it. It was a big white two-story frame house, and it set in the arc of a circular driveway about 100 feet back from the roadway, and it kind of went like this from the roadway, and then the house set right here. And you came in with your car or bicycle in one end of the driveway, and then you went back out onto the street at the other end. It was a circular driveway. Well, one day, I don't know exactly when, I noticed that a small room, sort of a shack, had been built or sat between the house and the roadway, about 20 feet back from the roadway. It might have already been there for a while when I noticed it, uh, but anyhow, it was about 10 feet high, and it seemed to be kind of a roundish shack, and the floor was built up a couple of feet from the ground, so it would sit up a little higher. Um, and it had windows on all the sides of it, so anybody inside could see out in any direction, and also from the outside could see in any direction. And it seems to me like it had little kind of louvers like Venetian blinds at the top of each window to stop the direct sunlight from coming in, but it was up high enough so that you could still see inside this room very well. One day I noticed a fellow inside that room. He was just sitting there on a chair. Um, when I first saw him, um, I had to cross Yosemite Boulevard to go over on the side where the houses were. And I was walking toward Empire, and I looked up and I saw this fellow sitting there on a chair. And when I first saw him, he had his head turned looking back uh, toward his house. And so I kept walking up that way, waiting for him to turn around. And when he turned around, I stopped in my tracks. My God, the whole side of his face here, and his cheek, uh, just below his nose or right at his nose, and part of his chin was all missing, like it had been cut away, and then it had sort of healed back a little bit. It didn't look it didn't look like a sore. It just looked like it was gone. This was gone. It was very, very grotesque. I couldn't say anything for a second. I just stood there and kind of stared at him. And by now, I was fairly close to him. And he looked back at me, and he gave me a semblance of a smile, and he waved. And I could see his mouth form the word hello, what was left of his mouth, one side. And so I waved and said hello, and I kept walking that way very slowly now, and I kept looking at this fellow. And he watched me as I walked by. And when I got up close to him, he waved at me one more time, and I waved at him. And then I went on by. I remember I didn't look back for a long ways. It must have been maybe 100 yards or 200 yards before I finally could get enough nerve to look back. The side of his face was gone. It just really looked terrible. It looked so grotesque. Um, Now, of course, it wouldn't be that bad, but people were different in those days. They looked, when you saw some person with some sort of a disability like that, with something wrong with them, the feelings were different. You sort of felt like that you should shun that person and not be too forward or too open with them. But anyhow, I remember that inside this room, this young fellow sat in a chair, and there was a small table, like a card table. And on the table was a pitcher that had water or Kool-Aid or lemonade or something in it, I'm sure, for the young man to drink as the day progressed, particularly on hot days. And I remember now, well, then even, that he wore a cap all the time. He never took his cap off. I never saw him without his cap. Now, this fellow was fairly young, maybe in his late teens or his early 20s. Um, and he was very slight. He was very skinny, like maybe the illness, whatever his illness was, had taken all the extra weight from him. And I remember that his skin looked sort of smooth, very smooth, glassy smooth, and a little bit pale. And I think back now, and it looks like maybe he had never shaved. He had no hair on his face, it seemed like. Um, and I really didn't know what to think about it. But after that, there were several times I went back there just to walk by this fellow. And each time I walked by him, he looked at me and he smiled and he waved and said hello and he nodded his head. And I stopped once, just briefly, and I don't know what I said, like, "How are you?" And I'm sure he said, "Oh, I'm fine, thank you." And I don't remember understanding what it was he said to me when he answered. But anyhow, I waved and smiled and said, "Okay, goodbye, see you later," or something like that, and I went on. Um, and he sat there for some time, and a lot of the kids from my neighborhood made a point to go by there and see this young fellow. I don't think any of them ever stopped. They would just wave and keep walking and keep looking at him. And he just sat there in his room, and each day, a certain time of the day, I guess, his parents would bring him out there. Maybe he could walk, I don't know, but I think he probably was carried out there, and he would sit in that chair, and he would look out all these windows and watch the cars as they went by and watch the people walk by. And he would wave and say hello, and sometimes people would notice him and see him, and they would wave back and say hello. Probably the cars were the best because they didn't have time to stop and look him over very closely, not like the people who were walking. Uh, but I'm sure that's how he spent, well, I know that's how he spent many of his days, because as I said, I made a point to go by there several times a week for several weeks. And I always wondered. I always wondered why he would be there and what was wrong with him and why part of his face was gone. I couldn't understand it at 10 years of age. Um, Anyhow, we heard later. I can't remember first. I can't remember the exact day when he wasn't there anymore. And it seems like one day I saw a grown-up walking from his little shack back to the house. I think it was an older lady, if I remember correctly. And that's the only time I ever saw anybody there, uh, except him sitting in this chair. And but one day I realized that he was gone. And he was gone, and the shack was gone. Uh, I remember walking by there and looking up, and there was absolutely nothing there. At the time, I had a craziest urge to go knock on the door. Just knock on the door and say, "Hey, where's this fellow that's been sitting out here all this time?" Because I've always been a very curious sort, maybe too much for my own good sometimes. But I didn't because of the grotesqueness of his face and how ugly he looked. And even though he seemed pleasant enough, I suppose. Uh, Anyhow, later the story was that he had had cancer, and the cancer had eaten away so much of his side of his face, and the surgeons had removed all they could of it and repaired it as well as they could in those days. And it was inside of him, and it was killing him and his parents because of his condition and his appearance. He had no friends, no close friends who would come to visit him in his home, or no relatives who would come to visit him in his home. So his parents, they loved him very much, and rather than have him sit in his room alone all day, day after day, until he died, they put this little shack out there for him to sit in. So even though he couldn't go out and mingle with people and walk around with people and say hello and shake hands and touch people and smile and receive encouragement uh, from people and just be a happy person, he at least could sit in this shack and watch the cars go by and watch the people walk by and wave and smile and say hello and pretend everything was just fine, that he would be all right someday. But he wasn't all right someday. We heard later, we don't know exactly when it happened, but it seems like everybody knew at the same time that this young man had died. And it seems like I recall somebody mentioned about a service, some sort of a service, but at 10 years old in Little Okie, I am sure on the day the service was held, I was probably down at the river where I spent most of my time. But I recall this fellow and his grotesqueness, and I think about it now, and I know that he probably was a very pleasant young man. He probably was very, very handsome young man before this disease started to eat on him and take away part of his face. And I'm sure that in this day and age, if this young man had been here now, it would have been much, much better for him. I'm sure that the plastic surgeons could have replaced part of his face and made him look a little more presentable. And even if they didn't, people now know enough that these things happen sometimes, and it's very unfortunate. But it's what's inside a person is what makes him beautiful and a wonderful person. And I'm sure this young man inside was a very, very wonderful, handsome young man, probably very pleasant, very loving, very caring. Uh, it's too bad that he couldn't be here now and to know the companionship that he never had in his last days there. But I'm thankful now. I think about it that he had such wonderful parents who would put this little shack out there and set a chair in it, a little table, a pitcher of Kool-Aid, so he could sit out here in his last days and watch the world go by and pretend that everything was going to be fine. And this is my story. It's the way it happened. And I thank you very much. This is JC.